Okay, let's begin. As I said, I'm going to be telling you about the different types of questions that come up in part 3 of the speaking test. I'm going to begin with comparison questions. Comparison questions are one of the most common types of questions in part 3. They ask you to compare two things, to talk about their similarities and differences. This question from the last session is a case in point. What is the difference between watching films in the cinema and watching films at home? To answer these questions, we can simply use some discourse markers, like on the other hand, to talk about the differences.
Well, obviously at the movies you can enjoy watching the movie on a bigger screen, but that's not all. Going to the movies can be a bonding experience. You usually do it with other people, you have fun together, and this helps your relationship develop. And something else I can think of is, at home, normally you can't watch movies that have just been released. But on the other hand, at the movie theater, some people have difficulties staying focused on the movie because some latecomers may pop in front of them, or someone may make noise. So in the home, they may feel relaxed with the movie.
But sometimes you may need to use comparatives to make comparisons. Let's say the question asks you to talk about the differences between people's homes in cities and people's homes in the countryside. This would be my answer to this question. By the way, pay attention to the idiom I'm going to use at the beginning. There is no comparison. It means they are very different. Let's watch this. There is just no comparison between them. Those in the countryside are generally a lot bigger because of the lower property prices. And I guess this is why apartment buildings and high-rises are a common sight in cities. Did you notice the comparatives bigger and lower? Sometimes you can also use as to make comparisons. For this question, for example, I can use as to say the same thing. There is no comparison between them. Generally speaking, because of the high property prices, those in the city are nowhere near as big as those in the countryside, which is why apartment buildings and high-rises are a common sight in cities. Anyway, sometimes the question that you get in the test asks you to compare the past with the present. For these questions, it might be a good idea to use used to talk about how things were in the past. And also you can use the present perfect sentences to talk about how things have changed. These questions are often asked this way: how has something changed? For example, how have the homes in your country changed over the last 20 years? Let's watch the answer to this question. One change that comes to mind is there didn't used to be nearly as many high-rises as today. More and more people are living in apartments today, which are now shrinking in size because of the increasing property prices. So I'd say more homes today are in the form of apartments, and they've generally become smaller than before. At the moment, this is all I can think of. As you saw, I used used to in the sentence, there didn't used to be nearly as many high-rises as today, which means today we've got a lot more high-rises. And I also use the present perfect in this sentence. Homes have generally become smaller than before. Let's watch the answer again. One change that comes to mind is there didn't used to be nearly as many high-rises as today. More and more people are living in apartments today, which are now shrinking in size because of the increasing property prices. So I'd say more homes today are in the form of apartments, and they've generally become smaller than before. At the moment, this is all I can think of. Let's talk about another type, opinion questions. These questions are the most common type of questions in part 3 of the speaking test. They ask you to express your opinion on something. Take this question, for example. Should governments protect old buildings? When answering these questions, make sure you use some discourse markers for giving opinions. For example, if you ask me, in my view, I'd say, and things like that. And one more thing, these questions sometimes start with how important. These are called how important questions. For example, the same question can be asked this way. How important is it to protect old buildings? Here's what you should keep in mind. You need to be able to use some paraphrases to talk about how important or unimportant something is. Let's watch the answer to this question. Pay attention to everything that I just told you. In my view, it depends on whether they are culturally and historically important or not. If they're not, it just doesn't make sense to invest lots of money in them to preserve them. If you ask me, they can be replaced with modern buildings, which can add to the beauty of the city. But if they are of cultural and historical importance, I think it's absolutely essential to preserve them because they are a link to the past. They can allow us to see firsthand what our ancestors built and may teach us some things, including how people lived in the past and what materials they used in buildings and stuff like that. The next type of questions I want to talk about is another subset of opinion questions, agree-disagree questions. Basically, they ask you to agree or disagree with a statement. For example, do you agree that governments should not protect old buildings because it is costly? To answer these questions, you need to be able to express your agreement or disagreement in a clear way. For example, if you completely agree, you could say, I couldn't agree more. Or if you completely disagree, you could say, I couldn't disagree more. And if you partly agree with the statement, you could say, I partly agree, or I agree up to a point. And then you should go on to explain what you mean. Remember, today I'm just trying to give you a picture of what part 3 questions are like. So don't worry about anything. Everything I'm saying today will be explained more in the future. Now let's watch the answer to this question. I couldn't disagree more, actually, but I think I know why some people feel this way. They may think that governments must prioritize the well-being of the population, and if they invest in preserving and restoring some monuments, they might not be able to do this. But I think they're wrong because these historically important monuments can attract lots of visitors. As you know, we've got something known as heritage tourism that can be a source of money for governments. Not to mention the fact that these monuments can give us a sense of identity. As I said earlier, they're a link to the past, and they can tell us how our ancestors lived in the past. So I think they must be preserved. You know, opinion questions can be asked different ways, so they can take different forms. But don't worry about anything. You're going to see lots of them in the future lessons, so you're going to get totally familiar with all of them. Anyway, let's talk about the next type of questions, prediction questions. Sometimes you need to predict how something will change in the future. For example, how do you think people's homes will change in the future? To answer these questions, sometimes you can use some fixed expressions. Something like, it's quite likely that something will happen. Or the opposite, it's quite unlikely that something will happen. And you can also use different future forms. For example, you can use the future continuous, will be doing something, if you think something will be in progress in the future. Let's watch my answer to this question. I think it's quite likely that more people will be living in smaller places because I think property prices are highly likely to keep going higher and higher, which will force many people to opt to live in smaller places, as naturally bigger places will be less affordable. The next type. Some questions ask you to simply give a list of things, to name some types of things, for example. These are factual questions. So what you say needs to be as factual as possible, based on facts. So there is no opinion involved unless when you want to talk about why something is the way it is, when you want to talk about the reason why something is the way it is. One good example could be this question. What are some popular types of homes in your country? To answer these questions, you need to use some discourse markers that are used to talk about our knowledge. Something like, as far as I know, or to the best of my knowledge. And something else is, these questions sound very easy. I mean, what's hard about just naming some types of things? But the thing is, as is the case with many other types of questions, actually all types of questions, you need to expand on what you're saying. You need to give reasons, you need to explain everything. So the easiest thing to do here is to talk about why this type of home, for example, is popular. So give reasons. Let's watch my answer to this question. I guess it depends on what parts of the country we're talking about. As in many other countries, in big cities, apartments are the favorite choice because they're generally cheaper than houses of the same size in the same neighborhoods, of course. But in smaller towns, different houses like ranch houses and bungalows are highly popular because of the lower property prices and also lifestyle choices. The last type of questions I want to be talking about today is hypothesizing questions. They ask you to talk about imaginary and theoretical situations. They want to see if you're able to imagine situations that aren't real. For example, how would life in cities be if there were no apartment buildings? You need to keep in mind that you're just imagining things. It's not a real situation. So grammatically speaking, you need to be careful about what you're saying. Let's see how I'll deal with this question. It's quite hard to imagine living without them. But without apartment buildings, there would definitely be a shortage of housing in many cities because it's the apartment buildings that have solved the problem of lack of space in big cities. The property prices would be a lot higher. And what else? Come to think of it, it would be no exaggeration to say that urban sprawl would be a huge problem all around the world. So I'd say life wouldn't be pleasant without apartment buildings. We're almost done here, but before I say goodbye, I want to recap the types of questions that we talked about today. One type of question was comparison questions, when you need to compare two things. Another one was opinion questions, when you need to express your opinion on something. And as I said, they can take different forms. And something else was prediction questions, when you need to say how something will change in the future. Listing questions, when you need to simply give some names of different types of something. And finally, hypothesizing questions, when you need to imagine some situations or one situation. Let me tell you something. Some questions can fit into different categories. So we can categorize these questions different ways. But why bother? What's important is now you have a clear picture of what part 3 questions are like, which means you'll be prepared for the next lesson. In the next lesson, I'll teach you some proper techniques and strategies that can help you extend your answers and do a better job. And good news for some of you, I'll be speaking Farsi. Goodbye.